My name is Dr. Lee Moore, and this is Podcast Taiwan Literature, a podcast on the history, literature, society, and culture of the world's most fascinating island. Brought to you by the National Museum of Taiwan Literature. Today we are talking about Liang, one of the great female writers to come out of Taiwan. A very interesting, fascinating feminist writer. Let's jump right into Liang's biography. Li was born in 1952 in Lugang, one of the old towns in Taiwan, a very old center of the Taiwanese economy at one point several centuries before. Now a lovely little tourist town and a major religious center. Liang is still alive, and Liang is actually not her real name. It's her pen name. Her given name is Shi Shu Duan. According to one scholar, she chose the name Liang as her pen name because the name Li comes from her mother, and she wanted to write against the patriarchy. And she thought the best way to do that was to choose a pen name that rejected patriarchy. I realize even before I've really explained anything about her writing, I think you're already getting a flavor of what her writing is like. We'll continue on with her biography. Her father was a businessman who was enamored with classical Chinese culture. Both of her sisters are also engaged in writing. This is a very literary family. Neither of the sisters are as famous as Liang is. When Li went to undergrad, she went to the Chinese Cultural University for her undergraduate degree, an interesting choice for her because, as we'll discuss later, as a writer, Liang is highly critical of Chinese culture and the hegemony of China over Taiwan's affairs. She also, and I have to say this, represented for the University of Oregon. She also went to the University of Oregon. She got her master's in theater here in Eugene. Of course, I personally am teaching at the University of Oregon's Chinese department, so I'm very happy about that. Liang returned from Oregon to Taiwan in the 1980s. She taught at her alma mater, the Chinese Culture University. Liang's also, just as a tidbit, she's also a bit of a foodie, having traveled around the world in search of some of the best dishes one can shove in one's face. She even turned her travels into a novel, Yuanyang Spring Dinner. Liang became a writer, and she is one of the most famous and controversial writers produced by the Taiwanese literary scene in the last 40 years. Her first major novel was quite famous. It was the 1983 Killing Husbands, Shafu, which for some reason has been translated into English as The Butcher's Wife. I think that Liang's original title is better, certainly more provocative. The novel, Killing Husbands, looks at a pig butcher in southern Taiwan who himself looks like a bit of a pig. I'm sure you're already seeing the patriarchy jokes coming. This butcher acts piggishly towards his wife, abusing his new wife, Lin Shi. The more she screams, the more the butcher seems to enjoy it. Her neighbors don't help as they gossip about her screaming while he beats her. Women are expected to put up with abuse during this period. Eventually, Lin Shi can take it no more, so she kills her piggish husband with his own cleaver. At the time the novel came out, it was very controversial. It contained depictions of brutal sexual violence, something that had hitherto not been a part of Taiwan literature. And some of the things that this novel contained would become Liang's calling cards. Graphic and uncensored depictions of sex, and also a very negative portrayal of the patriarchy in traditional Taiwanese culture. All this drove purchases and discussions of the novel and made Liang into a literary star. We talked a bit about nativist literature, 乡土文学, in an earlier episode. Liang, she doesn't slot into the nativist literature category. I don't know why exactly. I think she, like Huang Chunming, could be categorized as a nativist writer. Much of her oeuvre is concerned with what it means to be Taiwanese, what the situation of Taiwan is. She's thinking about Taiwan and the role that Taiwaneseness plays in the world, particularly in comparisons with the Chinese identity. But for some reason, the scholars that I have looked at that have discussed Liang, very few of them frame her as a nativist writer. I suspect the reason is because she's a feminist writer. And so when people writing about literature in Taiwanese media, when they talk about Liang, they always put her into this single category. She's a feminist writer. Therefore, she's not discussed as someone who does nativist literature. But I think that's a silly way to think about Liang as a writer. That's a silly way to think about any writer. If you have a good writer, they're going to be complicated. They're not going to be one-dimensional. Liang, her interest in nativist Taiwanese issues is something that folds into her interest in feminism. Her observations on gender and the threat that men pose to women is very much informed by the threat that China poses to Taiwan. That's a comparison that I think lingers over much of her work. Liang has published about a score of novels, along with many essays, short stories, and other literary works. Several of her works have been turned into films or television dramas. Her works have been translated into many languages. There are actually 3 different editions of The Butcher's Wife in English, a sign of how influential that work is. There are also translations of her novels Flower Season, A Love Letter Never Sent, and The Lost Garden. And today we are going to focus in on that last novel, The Lost Garden. The Lost Garden, Miyuan, is published in Taiwan in 1991. There are a couple of reasons we're going to focus on Lost Garden. First off, I'm the one doing the podcast, and I think Lost Garden is probably her best work, so I kind of just landed on doing it that way. Second, though, I think that it's not only my favorite work, but also it's a work that's fairly representative of much of her output. The novel Lost Garden moves along 2 separate tracks. There are 2 separate stories from 2 different eras, each told with an eye towards the other. The narrator of the novel is named Zhu Yinghong. The first plotline focuses on Zhu Yinghong's father. Zhu Zuyan is one of those intellectuals caught up in this white terror campaign. He's imprisoned, and when he is released from prison, he literally walls himself within the Lotus Garden, a garden built along classical Chinese aesthetic lines, a garden that has been in his family for several generations and has historical value. But while walling himself up from the world, Zhu Zuyan wallows in the pleasures of the garden and ends up squandering the family's wealth. So that's one plotline. Second plotline. Unlike the first plotline, the second plotline is focused on the narrator's present. That is, it focuses on the late 1980s and the early 1990s. We follow the narrator, Zhu Yinghong, as she meets a guy, Lin Shigeng, a real estate tycoon and a playboy. They chase after each other, each seeking to quench their own desires in the other, but also holding out for what they most want from this relationship, something their partner initially refuses to give the other. Lin Shigeng continues sleeping with other women, particularly prostitutes. This is something that the novel is very in your face about. Zhu Yinghong wants to get a commitment from Lin, both in terms of money, but also in terms of a sexual commitment. Initially, Lin exercises power over Zhu. This is a power that's both sexual and moral. Let me read you a passage from their first sexual encounter. So this is taken from the English translation, page 67-68. Lin Shigeng's tone of voice was unchanged, and there was no hint of ambiguity in what he was saying. Nor was he trying to arouse her. They were saying goodbye, and this caught Yinghong completely by surprise. Not until he'd had his say did some of the words get through, and she suddenly realized what he was talking about and exactly what those words referred to. Totally unprepared for what she was hearing, it dawned on her that the common, ordinary phrases he used were all about sex, and that, oddly enough, she was aroused. Submissive as usual, she followed his signal and dutifully opened the gate. They went into the yard, where she let him lead her hand down to touch him, without thinking about where her hand was going, she stroked him as he desired, her heart neatly breaking over the idea that he was about to leave her. But he had already deftly undone his trousers to expose himself, and was standing there otherwise fully clothed. The skill with which he had accomplished this shocked her. He must have known how to make love on various occasions, the only difference being the time, place, and the woman he was with. He slid his hands under her clothes to touch her. Like so many women in love, she shied away from, even rejected a sexual encounter out of the pain of imminent separation, and when he saw that it was not to be, he led her in a different direction. Ying Hong sensed his arousal in her hand and knew there was no going back. A masculine instinctive ability to convey dominance was part and parcel of Xingeng's personality. Confusion and admiration combined to prompt her to look down and gaze lovingly at what she held in her hand. It's so big, yet what filled her heart was the sorrow of the night, for when it was over she would never see him again, let alone the thing she was holding. With a mixture of what her rejection of a goodbye kiss had meant and the entangled emotions of loss in her mind, she looked down and stared dully at it. Then a pair of strong hands pressed down on her shoulders, and she knew what he wanted. So she bent down hesitantly as his hands brought her forcefully to the point where her lips touched it. She remained crouching for a long moment before changing positions to kneel in front of it. Having her on her knees heightened his air of potency as he stood there and highlighted her constant submissiveness and obedience towards him. Fascination and admiration engulfed her as he looked down from his prideful height and said, "That is a man's prized possession and finest weapon. It has to be used if it's brought out." And then, in a domineering tone of voice, he said, "Do you still want to tell me not to call you?" Okay, I'm just going to stop there. So this passage has quite a lot to unpack. First off, the language of sex is all about the man dominating the woman. Lin is dominating Zhu. So we have the narrator describe how having Zhu on her knees heightens Lin's air of potency. He loves the fact that she's submissive and obedient towards him. This is something that's kindling his desire. That kind of language is featured throughout this passage and really throughout the earlier part of the book. Lin Shigeng is getting off on the fact that he has power over Zhu Yinghong. Another thing this passage highlights, it's a calling card for Liang. It's very explicit. In fact, it's borderline pornographic. This is something that you could find in a dime store romance novel that you would read on the beach. Of course, Liang is a literary writer, so she's handling this in a much more professional manner, but still the tone, the kind of throbbing language that runs throughout this passage that I read, but throughout the entire novel. She takes this trashy romance novel language and she elevates it to something beyond a trashy romance novel. She consumes it and turns it into a work of feminist literary genius. Throughout this novel, Lin's power somehow is connected with his control over land. Remember I said he was a real estate tycoon? There's something about his control of land, of real estate, that makes him sexually potent. I don't think it's ever explicitly explained in the novel, and I've struggled with how to interpret Lin's power and the connection to land. But there's one point in the novel where there's this discussion of sex with multiple women, and it quickly becomes a discussion of the sale of houses. Lin Xigeng initially tries to push Zhu Yinghong to fit as one of the many partners he has in his polyamorous ways. Lin Xigeng wants to keep her as one of the many women he keeps in his stable of women he sleeps with, but somehow, and the process in the novel is somewhat magical and never explicitly stated, but somehow she gains power over him. It's never made clear what exactly happens, but the power that she has over him has to do with this mysterious garden that she inherits from her father. Their first romp in the eponymous garden, which occurs just 20 pages or so after the passage that I read above, it happens, and Lin somehow seems to have less power over Juinghong when they are having their sexual relationship. Once they have sex in the garden, throughout the rest of the novel, we're going to watch as Lin's power over Juinghong slowly dissipates, and Zhu gains power over Lin Shigeng. The garden seems to somehow disarm him. It's not clear what happens. Liang never explicitly states what she's thinking, but it's clear that the garden is partially the source of Zhu's power. During this period, there is a botanical discussion, and the vegetation is very politicized. So Zhu Zuyan, Juinghong's father, has a problem. He loves the plane tree that he has in his historic garden, even though the plane tree does not belong in Taiwan. Rather, this tree is a transplant brought from China. The plane tree comes to China. The plane tree comes from China, and it's having trouble adapting to the Taiwanese environment. Yet still, the father is loath to get rid of it. But once Juinghong takes over the garden, she switches from plane trees to flame trees. The flame tree, being a native Taiwanese tree, is better suited to the local environment. As the flame tree takes over and pushes the plane trees out, there seems to be a shift in power from male to female, from an orientation towards China to an orientation towards Taiwan. There is also, in the character of Juinghong, this attempt to fashion a Taiwanese identity that's distinct from China. We hear about Juinghong's father. He's too close to China, at least as the novel frames it. But Juinghong herself is an interesting mix. The novel discusses her eyes, and at several points it highlights the fact that her eyes are not Chinese, but rather Dutch. And there is the suggestion that Juinghong, from her mother and from her father's ancestors, is actually something more than Chinese in terms of the bloodline. Those are the terms that the novel uses. Those are not my terms. Juinghong is herself a metaphor for the Taiwanese subject, the perfect Taiwanese identity. She's someone who takes Chinese elements, but also Dutch, Western elements, Japanese elements even, and she mixes them together to create her own identity, an identity that's distinct, that's Taiwanese, that's something new. The novel spells this out both in terms of Juinghong's heritage, the heritage that she embodies in her genes, but also in the way that she manages the garden. Juinghong takes this classical Chinese garden and she opens it up to a wider range of botanical possibilities. But this garden seems even more important than I'm giving it credit for. It's actually the key to this novel, which is not surprising because it's called The Hidden Garden. I had mentioned that Juinghong had sex with Lin Shigeng in the garden. And this is one of the points where he seems to be losing power over her. The garden somehow seems to be a symbol of Juinghong's own personal sexuality. There's a passage where Juinghong is fingering some of the material in a dusty shed in the garden, where the garden itself almost seems like a site of her sexuality on page 142. I'm not going to read the passage. I just want to draw attention to the fact that the garden is somehow a site of her own personal sexuality. All of these questions, sex, power, Taiwan, China, plants, they all come together in one of the more fascinating novels that has come out of Taiwan in the last few decades. I think I am going to leave it here. This is a great novel. I'd highly encourage you to take a look at it. It's The Lost Garden by Liang. My name is Dr. Lee Moore. This is Podcast Taiwan Literature. a podcast on the history, literature, society, and culture of the world's most fascinating island. Until next time, thanks for listening. 多谢